And in case anyone missed them, I am going to go ahead and put the links in the chat again to all of the workshop resources. You should be able to use those throughout the workshop today. And then we'll go ahead. So welcome to our workshop today on information literacy, teaching context appropriate search strategies. I'm really happy to have you all here today. This is the second workshop in our information literacy series for this summer. We do have several other workshops planned. So hopefully if you do like this one, that you'll be interested in coming back and attending some of the workshops coming up, and I'll have links to all of those at the end of the workshop and as well as in the follow-up email that I send you all. So before we jump into the content, I wanted to just take a minute to check and see how everyone is feeling today. So based on the CAT scale available, if you just wanted to post a chat, the number that corresponds to how you're feeling today, the numbers might be a little bit hard to see. So they start at the top left. So 1, 2, 3 across the top, 4, 5, 6 across the middle, and then 7, 8, 9 across the bottom, left to right for each of those. So please feel free to go ahead. It might be a mix of some of these, that's okay as well. All right, I see quite a lot of number 3s coming in. So number 4s. Oh, a number 4 had a 2-hour phone call with IT. Yeah, I can definitely understand a number 4 after that one, Janelle. Some number 5s coming in. 5, 4. Oh, we're at a 4. 4 and 5. Good. 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 8. We have an 8 in there. So 8, that sounds great. A couple of 8s. That's wonderful to see. So thank you all so much for sharing how you are feeling today. Should be using a poll. Yep. We do have some polls in the presentation. I always just tend to use the chat for easy ones like this one. So we'll go ahead and do some real quick trivia. So we have some summer song trivia. So I have some lyrics here to some different songs that all feature the word summer somewhere in the title or in the song itself. So if you know any of these, you can post in the chat the artist or the song, and we'll just kind of briefly. So A is, oops, I didn't mean to stop sharing. I'm going to resume sharing. Sorry about that. There we go. A, nobody on the road, nobody on the beach. I feel it in the air. The summer's out of reach. Empty lake, empty streets. The sun goes down alone. B is, I got my first real 6-string, bought it at the 5 and dime, played it till my fingers bled. C is, summer loving had me a blast. Summer loving happened so fast. I met a girl crazy for me. Met a boy cute as can be. D, and I remember how you loved me. Time was all we had until the day we said goodbye. I remember every moment. And then E, riding in the drop top with the top down. Saw you switching lanes, girl. Pull up to the red light, looking right. Come on, let me get your name, girl. So if you know any of those artists, song name, please go ahead and put those in the chat. I see some responses coming in. So let's see. Are all of this from before 1991? Oh, pretty much most of them, I think, except for E, are all probably before 1991, for sure. B, Bryan Adams. Yep, so correct there. Michael got that one right, Bryan Adams. C, Olivia Newton-John. So that is absolutely right. So that's from Greece there. C from Greece. Yep, Kathy got that one too. So we have a guess of B of Bruce Springsteen. So that is actually Bryan Adams, right? So Summer of '69, of some folks have pointed out. Sarah got E, Justin Timberlake. Absolutely. So great. Yeah, and I do apologize, as I think I mentioned last week, if you're here, like, I don't like follow popular culture at all. So all my references are all from the 80s or 90s, almost all. So I'm sorry about that. I will try to get more updated references. So A, I don't know if anyone guessed that one there. A is The Boys of Summer by Don Henley. And E or D, I don't know if anyone got that one. That's a really obscure one, I think. That is Endless Summer Nights by Richard Marx. So thank you all for participating in our summer song trivia. activities. And again, I definitely will get more updated references for the next time around. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Jane Hammonds, and I'm an assistant professor in university libraries. I'm the teaching and learning engagement librarian. You can reach me at hammonds.73@osu.edu. Please feel free to email me if you do have any questions, comments, or concerns after the workshop. I'm always happy to talk more about these concepts. What we're going to be doing today is talking about information searching. We're going to think about information searching as a contextualized experience. And then we'll think about some strategies and activities that we can use to help teach our students to consider context as part of their search process. So Vicki shared, no worries, you'll lose half of us if you get updated. Yeah. All right, I did want to just remind everyone that the workshop today, attendance counts as 1 hour credit toward the teaching information literacy endorsement from the Drake Institute for Teaching and Learning. So if you are affiliated with Ohio State and you're interested in earning that endorsement, you can count this today. I put some links in the chat for the reflection and the participation tracking if you are interested in doing that endorsement. If you have questions about that, please just email me afterwards and we can make sure that you get all set up for that endorsement. All right, so let's take a look then and think about context and searching. So we're going to do just a very quick reflective activity first. You don't have to respond to this if you would like, but just pick one of these information needs and just reflect a little bit on what your search process might look like if that was the information that you would need. So we'll just give everyone just 30 seconds to think about how they might go about searching for this information if this is what they were looking for. So chances are, as you thought about these different options and looked at one, depending on which one you picked, your search might have looked different. Even if you use the same search tool for all of these, something about your search process might look a little different depending on which of these that you actually picked. Right? And so that's really what we want to focus on here today. This idea that, and this is from the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education, that information searching is a contextualized and complex experience that affects and is affected by the cognitive, affective, and social dimensions of the searcher. And so we can't just divorce any kind of information searching that we're doing from the context that we're in or from the context where we are going to be using or sharing that information. And as you think about older definitions and understandings of information literacy, presented a very mechanical view of information literacy that basically was the same for every person in every context. Like, this is what a good information searcher does. This is what a good information source looks like. And we know that that's not the case, that it is going to be different, the search process, depending on the context that we are in. So that's what we wanted to talk about a little bit today. So if you are affiliated with Ohio State, I did want to highlight that within the new general education expected learning outcomes that are going to be implemented this fall, as we mentioned, information literacy is mentioned throughout those expected learning outcomes, and it specifically highlights this impact of context. So you can see that in different places throughout the general education expected learning outcomes, that we're not hoping to teach students one specific, very generalized way of searching, but we want our students to think about searching and finding and using information within the specific context that they are in. So I wanted to just give us a chance to think a little bit more about how context actually impacts the search process. So we're going to go out and use a Jamboard. And if you're not familiar with one of those, we'll show in just a second what those look like. But I want to put the link in the chat just one more time. So you should see the link to the Jamboard there in the chat that I just shared. Right, and we're going to try to go out here and access the Jamboard. All right, so hopefully this should be what everyone is seeing. If you've never used Jamboard before, I think the easiest way to add your response is to go over here on the left-hand side. You'll see an option to add a sticky note. You can click on that option there. You can pick your color, write your text there, and then just go ahead and post that. So we'll give everyone a chance to respond. You can think very broadly or very specifically, whatever comes to mind when you think about how context impacts the search process. So I see some responses coming in. We'll give everyone just a few seconds more if you want to respond. Again, if you're not comfortable, that's okay as well. Some of the responses that we're seeing. So how does context impact the search process? It guides it, right? It helps determine type of source that's being looked for. It might change what search engine or research database that I use. It might change how credible the information has to be, or the level of authority that is needed for a good source. Depends on the depth of information, the types of sources that you need. It might determine how hard you are searching for accurate information to prove a point. The time scale, so whether recent news event or ongoing scholarship, the audience, so how technically specific versus layperson the information needs to be. Yeah, so those are all wonderful responses that I think really demonstrate how many different ways context impacts the search process, right? Someone just posted determines the urgency of the information need. So all of these different ways are ways that our search process is impacted by the context. So thank you all so much for sharing your responses there. We're going to go ahead and go back to our presentation here. So as you see, you all highlighted in your responses everything that I was thinking of too when I was thinking of this. The types of information sources that would be considered authoritative or appropriate or relevant, the types of search tools that you might want to use, the resources that you would want to use, how you would approach source evaluation. So what would be considered a good or a bad source, right? How much information you might need, how many sources might be needed to accomplish your purpose. And then I think, and someone mentioned this as well, our motivations around searching. How important is this to us that we find the right information? How important is it? How does it affect our ability to understand our search results, right? And for that last point specifically that I wanted to mention, I just wanted to highlight this point, right? If we think about those questions that we had earlier, how safe is the COVID-19 vaccine? This might be one where we think, okay, we need to go for the highest level of authority possible, right? This is such an important question. If we want to convince people that the vaccine is safe, how are we going to do this? We're going to go to the highest level of sources. We're going to look for those scholarly journal articles, like the one on the right that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. But then we have to think again about our context. How many of us are going to understand all of the content that is in an article like that? So as we think about this, those highest level sources that are intended for experts in the field, within a specific context, are those always going to be the most appropriate types of sources? I think we tend in higher education to emphasize for students that they should be going for scholarly sources. But it's important to recognize that depending on the audience, depending on the use of that source, maybe that scholarly journal article is not the best. We need one step removed from that. We need an article like the one on the left-hand side that's from Johns Hopkins, but is written for a more general audience. Okay? So I just wanted to highlight that as bringing up this point, thinking not just about what the best type of source is, what the best type of source is for our particular audience, our specific need. So what then are some of the different contexts in which students might be researching or searching for information? So if we think about the academic context as one particular type of context that students might be searching for information, what are some of the other types of contexts where students might be searching for information? We'll go ahead and go back out to the Jamboard to do that. So the same link should take you out to that same Jamboard. And then what you should be able to do is just click up here on the top here. You can switch to the second screen there. And again, you can follow the same process to post your response. Just go ahead and do a sticky note. So what are some of the different contexts in which our students or we might be searching for information other than the academic context? Yep, Barbet, absolutely. Some of the responses coming in. So weather, personal, medical, career exploration, sports scores, to prove a point to our family on Facebook, right? To determine which product that we want to buy, learn more about travel. So where we're going to travel, the best ways to travel, hobbies, how to follow up on them, news, curiosity, how to find good books, how to find music lyrics, how to find sports scores, right? So I think these are all great responses. Thank you all for sharing those. Decorating dorm. Yep. So there's all different reasons that our students might be seeking information, why we are seeking information. So we'll go ahead and go back there to our presentation again. Thank you all for sharing your responses there. So here's, again, just an overview of some of the different contexts that students might be seeking information. This is from a website that I'll share with you, a link to this at the end, called Teaching Information Literacy, the Contextual Nature of Research, where a librarian has outlined these different contexts where searching might be taking place. So we have the academic context that we probably are all most familiar with, but within that, more specifically, we have our disciplinary context. So we know that some of the general search skills that students might learn that might be effective at academic research might still not be appropriate or effective in our specific discipline. So that's kind of a little bit more narrow focus. And then we have those broader contexts, the professional context, the creative context, the personal context, all of those ways that students might be searching for information, the types of information that they might need. How well do we think that students navigate transferring between different contexts? So I have just a very quick poll here. I don't think I actually set this up as a poll in Zoom. So we'll just do it as a poll here in chat. So you can just put a response from 1, strongly agree, to 5, agree. So for A, students tend to use a limited number of search tools and show little inclination to vary the frequency or order regardless of their information need or context. So if you just wanted to post in chat your response there from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree for statement A. So we see lots of responses coming in. Seems like most folks are in the line of 4 or 5. So agree or strongly agree that students tend to use a limited number of search tools and show little inclination to vary. So for statement B, when faced with an information need, students usually attempt to find the quickest answer they can using a search engine. So agree, 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. See responses coming in again. Yep, so we see most folks in the line of 4 or 5 with a few 3s thrown in there, as well as the short responses coming in. 4, yeah. So those of you that selected 4 or 5, You might be happy to know that there is research backing up your perspective. Project Information Literacy has done several studies on how students search for information. And these are some of the key findings that they've had, that students do tend to use a very limited number of search tools. They use the same search tools over and over again. They're driven by familiarity and habits and focus on finding the quickest answer that they can. And so there's some research backing this up. And I think that we all know from, the responses that came in from our experiences ourselves working with students. Right? How many times have we heard, well, I use this database. Why? Well, it's the database that I know how to use, right? Even if it's not going to be the database that's most appropriate for their particular information need. So then, thinking about context-specific search and it's big picture of information literacy, I wanted to take just a minute to kind of step back and talk about information literacy in a very big picture, and then we'll kind of move on again and talk about some activities and strategies that you can use to help students think about context as part of the search process. So I did want to just highlight again this definition of information literacy. Some of you might be familiar with this already, some might not. This is the definition of information literacy from the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education that really emphasizes information literacy as a set of integrated abilities that includes these broad conceptual understandings about how information is created and accessed and shared, and the participation in communities of knowledge. So it's a different perspective of information literacy than the one that I mentioned earlier that had this very mechanical understanding of what information literacy was, sort of a step-by-step search process. And what the Framework for Information Literacy does, it highlights core understandings that students need to develop in order to really be able to effectively engage with information. These are things that more experienced researchers sort of know or understand, sometimes without even realizing that they understand them, but that novice learners may not yet understand, and that may create difficulties for them in being able to effectively search for or find information. So I do want to highlight 3 core concepts that I see that are related to searching and context. If you're interested in the other core concepts that are mentioned in the framework, on the participant handout, I put the links there. On the participant handout, you can see all of those different described with information about each one. There is 3 that I just wanted to highlight. So this first one is this idea of searching as strategic exploration. Right? To be able to search effectively, students have to recognize that search tools have different characteristics and different capabilities, that one database is not the same as the other, that a database is not the same as a search engine, that there are other tools outside of databases or search engines that they can search, and that they have to learn how to vary their search based on the information need. But of course, that requires an understanding of why those different search tools are different and how they're different, which is not always apparent. Because everything can kind of look the same in terms of search tools that are available, and students may not recognize how different these kinds of tools can be. The second concept that I wanted to highlight is authority is constructed and contextual. So this one talks about this idea of recognizing, and we've mentioned this already, in different contexts, certain sources are going to be considered more authoritative or more appropriate or more relevant than others. And that could be a different discipline, it could be a community, it could be a profession. Each of those will have different understandings of what is considered an appropriate source or what is considered good evidence. And students have to have an understanding of that context and recognize that it's not always going to be the same. And then the third core concept that I wanted to highlight was information creation as a process. So this really highlights this idea that there are so many different types of resources out there. There are so many different types of sources, and recognize that those different types of sources, again, have different capabilities, different constraints, different uses. And so understanding why specific types of sources might be different than other sources is important for knowing which types of sources are going to be relevant in the particular context. So these are some of the sort of key deep understandings that students really need to have to be able to be effective searchers. So I just wanted to bring this up again and mention, so here are the general education expected learning outcomes. So I think you can start to see how that the framework influenced these outcomes and these connected to these learning outcomes, this idea that we have to have context as part of our search process. So some specific skills and dispositions that students might need to be able to search. So they need to know who the interested parties are that might be producing information on a topic, right? So who creates authoritative information on this topic? They need to be able to match their information need with a search tool. For that, they need to understand how these information systems actually work. They need to understand when to use different types of search language. So when is it appropriate to use general language? When do you need to use more discipline specific or profession specific language? Recognizing how information sources differ. And of course, we think about the affective area, have to be flexible, have to be creative, have to be persistent, understanding that searching takes time, and that in some contexts, they are going to have to put in more of an effort when they're searching than others, right? If all we want to do is know what the weather is like, it doesn't really matter what source we use and how quickly our response is. But in other situations, we have to recognize that we're going to have to be more persistent and we're going to have to be more flexible in our search strategies. So we'll take a pause here to see what's in the chat. That's a good question. Reflective discovery and participative ethically are in the definition. Yeah, I can respond to that, Michael, a little bit later if that is okay. And then we'll pause here and think about other skills, habits, or understandings that you think that students might need. And also, if you have any questions at this point, we'll pause here before we jump in to thinking about activities and resources that are available. So any questions, comments that you might have here, and then any additional skills, habits, or understandings that you think students might need at this point. You can go ahead and post those in the chat if you'd like. I'll just pause. Okay, so let's jump in and think then about some teaching strategies and activities that we might be able to use. To get us started with this, I just wanted to put this question out there first to see if there are things that you do to encourage students to consider context as part of the search process that you would like to share. You don't have to share them right now. You can keep this in mind as we go through the activities. But if there is something that you've done that you find really helpful and you're comfortable sharing that, please go ahead and post that in the chat. We'd love to hear other ideas for how people are really encouraging students to think about context as part of the search process. So Cher shared how to identify credible sources. And Cher said, I share the CRAP test. So Jordan said, I'm sorry, what? So the CRAP test is a evaluation strategy that has often been taught by librarians that encourage students to consider currency, relevance, authority. Oh gosh, I'm a bad librarian. What is the other one? Authority, something, and purpose. Oh my gosh, I can't remember. Accuracy. Thank you, Kathy. Oh my gosh, I'm a bad librarian. So that is one evaluation strategy that we sometimes teach. In the university libraries, we tend to teach a lateral reading strategy. So we're actually be talking about evaluation strategies in one of the upcoming workshops. So we don't tend to use CRAP as much anymore as our evaluation test. So Sarah, if you're interested in learning more about lateral reading, please be on the lookout for those upcoming workshops as well. All right, so let's go ahead then and look at some ways that we might be able to encourage students to consider context. So my first thought is really just a strategy. And I have this down as be transparent. So basically identify or define a context for your students and their assignment instructions. I think we often tend to assume that students either understand what the context is or that the context is just going to be the academic context and you are going to be the only audience. But if you want them to think about other contexts or other audiences, define those for those students, identify those for those students so that they recognize um, what you are looking for so that they can keep that in mind. And I've got an example here. This is one of the assignments that we use in one of our courses. We give students specific scenarios as part of their final assignment. You can pick one of these, you can pick one of these, but whichever one you pick, you have to keep that in mind when you're working on your final project, and things have to be relevant to that particular context that you have picked. So we really try to emphasize that this is not just general research that you're doing this in the context of whatever scenario you have selected. And I almost, for this one, instead of putting be transparent, I almost put be authentic, because I think as much as we can, giving our students those authentic assignments where they're actually doing something that it might have real world implications, or at least tries to mimic a real world context, I think is helpful, because if we just always are just teaching our students to research within the academic context, I think we're doing them a disservice. So if we think about what are the scenarios that students might be using information, and can I give those to them? An example of a group that I just worked with was an instructor who's doing an assignment for students in nursing. And it specifically states in that assignment that students have to gear this toward their patients, right? They are giving information to their patients. And so they have to keep that in mind and think about what kinds of sources are going to be most relevant or convincing to my patients within this process. So anytime you can do that, be transparent or authentic about the context in which you want students to be using information. That would be my first sort of big recommendation. So Nicole shared, I do an activity with my students to get them familiar with using word reference for looking up words in different languages, which is more accurate than Google Translate. Yeah, thank you. Okay. The other sort of big picture strategy I wanted to mention is, this might be a little bit of the opposite of what I just said. But if you are having students research within the context of your specific discipline, and it's really important that they are thinking about that discipline in mind, decode your discipline for them, right? So don't assume that they know what databases are most relevant in your discipline. Don't assume that they know which types of sources that you want them to use in that discipline. If there are non-traditional types of sources that tend to be used in your field, maybe students are used to doing more traditional research, but you're teaching a film studies class and you want them to use reviews. They might not have any idea how to find reviews because that's not a traditional type of source that they've looked up. So decoding your discipline, I think, just letting them know, again, this goes back to the point of what context they're actually searching in so that they can keep that in mind as they're going through. Stepping back a little bit, something that you can do, and this could be any type of assignment, it wouldn't necessarily have to be like a full research assignment, but have students develop an outline or a plan prior to any type of project where they're going to be searching for information, and make sure that they have to think about and answer questions about their intended audience and the specific context that they're searching as part of that search plan. So I have an example up there. I have a link to this sample assignment on the handout for everyone in case anyone wants to look at this one. But they have to describe their research context as part of their search. They have to think about, okay, within this context, then who is my audience? They can go back to this throughout the whole search if they, for example, are doing a full semester project, each time going back and thinking about, okay, in the context that I'm searching, was my search strategy appropriate? Was the databases that I used or the search tools that I use appropriate? Are the sources that I'm finding appropriate for that context? So they're keeping that in mind from the beginning of the search process and always going back to that and thinking about that as they're searching. This is just a quick little activity that you can do. As I mentioned, students may not realize how different the results might be depending on which search tool that they are using. So this is something that I would do with students a lot. I would just assign each group of students a different search tool to use. They would search for the same thing, and I would write up on the whiteboard which search tool it was, and I would just write the number of results that they found. Very quick and basic, and they would see like, oh, hey, in this database, I got 100,000 results, and this one I got 25, and this one I got, 10 million results, so that they could see that same exact search is going to get them very different results depending on which search tool that they use. So you can start to have them think about, okay, now in the context of your particular search, in the context of this course, which of these do we think is going to be the most effective tool to use? So that we're just getting them familiar with the range of search tools that are available to them, and letting them recognize the importance of thinking about that as part of the search process. So we'll pause here for the chat. All right, cool, thank you. I'm so glad to see that people are sharing things in the chat. That's super exciting. Yeah, thank you for sharing word reference, Nicole. Wonderful. So I thought we'd do a quick little activity here. This is similar to another one that I've done with students before. We're going to go out and do a Menti poll for this one here. So we'll put those links in there. One more time, you should see the Menti poll link here. And what this will allow you to do is to go out and has an information need there and 4 different types of information sources. And you could rank the sources based on which one you think is most appropriate for that particular information need. So we're going to go out and take a look here. All right, so that is the Jamboard. Hopefully this should be what you all are seeing. If it's not, please someone let me know. So this is the information need that you have. You need a brief list of key events in the American Civil War. You have 4 different types of sources: a scholarly journal article, encyclopedia article or website, historical monograph, and a Civil War documentary. And you can rank these based on the one that you think would be most relevant or effective in that situation down to the least one. All right, so we'll give everyone a chance to rank. And again, if anyone's having trouble accessing that poll, please go ahead and post that in the chat. Let's see, responses coming in. So as we can see, looking at the responses that have come in, for a brief list of key events in the American Civil War, a lot of folks have indicated that an encyclopedia article or encyclopedia website might be the best type of source, whereas a scholarly journal article would probably be the least effective type of source in that situation. And I've done this kind of activity with students. You might have several different types of information needs and go through each one and see how the sources change depending on what the particular information need is. And so this again gets students thinking about this idea that even though we may have been taught, to go out and find scholarly journal articles, they're not always going to be appropriate for every type of information need. And a book may not be the best, in other cases it will. So if you try this and just kind of went through a few different types of information needs, got students talking and thinking about when it's perfectly fine to use an encyclopedia, or when it's fine to use Wikipedia, and when it might not be. I think this kind of really quick activity can be something that's helpful just to get students thinking about that. So again, thank you everyone for participating in that. We'll go ahead and go back to our presentation. Few different other activities that I just wanted to go through really briefly. See how time we're actually almost doing okay on time for once. This is based on a video that I found that was developed by McMaster University. They have an interesting video on search versus research. So this might be something that you could do with students in class, have them write a definition of search versus research. What is the difference between those two terms? And you could provide questions like, how do they differ in terms of the types of sources that you might need or how much time you might spend. So getting them to think initially of what the difference is between those two terms. Then they could watch this video, they could go back and revisit their initial definitions and think about, what are different search scenarios versus research scenarios. So a search scenario, what's the weather going to be? Who won the Rose Bowl last year? Very quick searches versus those more detailed research scenarios. so that they're recognizing those different contexts of search. Self-explaining. If you've been to one of my workshops before, I love self-explaining activities. So this is very similar. Provide students with a context, provide them with a specific audience, have them explain either verbally and writing to you, to another student, how they would go about searching for information in each of these different contexts. What evidence, what types of sources would they use, so that they're having to actually verbalize their search process. Think about it critically and identify the specific clues in that particular context that would lead them in one direction or the other, who the audience is, what would be most relevant to them. And this is just an example of some of the different ways that you could do this. So I took one topic of algorithmic bias in sentencing in terms of criminal justice, and 4 different particular contexts or audiences that they might be using information. So in one case, maybe they're presenting at a conference on criminal justice. In another case, they're talking to Ohio State students. Maybe they're doing something for the general public and they're interested in just raising awareness. Another situation, maybe they're trying to convince legislators to pass some law, related to algorithmic biases. So having them explain in each of these contexts what their search process might be, what types of sources would be most effective, so that they're starting to verbalize those processes. Comparing or evaluating search strategies. This is very similar, but this is something that I do in one of the courses that I teach that's actually for instructors. But you could do this as like a discussion board in Canvas if you wanted to, or whatever your learning management system is. I give this search situation. Here's this student. He graduated from Ohio State. He's gone out and he's working for this company. He needs information, but he starts to find out that the search process that he learned how to use when he was a college student is not getting him the information that he needs. And so the responses, why isn't this search process working? What would he need to do different in this particular context? So having students go through and respond to a discussion board post like this, individually or as part of groups, so that they're outlining, recognizing what the different context is and how that might impact that search. Another example of an assignment that you could do would be to have students, if students are creating some sort of bibliography, an annotated bibliography, or just for a research paper, have them do that in stages throughout the semester or the period of the project. Maybe week 2, our initial searches are all going to be in Google, and then maybe week 4 we're going to search in Google Scholar, and week 6 we're going to search in a database, so that we're searching using different search tools each time, and we're seeing how our results differ. We're seeing how the types of sources that we get differ, and we're recognizing that it may be that in this particular context it was the Google Scholar search that was most helpful, whereas in another context maybe it was that first Google search that was most helpful, so that they're required to use multiple types of search tools throughout that whole search process. This is very similar to that, but this would be one where from the beginning, students recognize that they're going to have to present whatever their research findings are in 2 different formats. One that's going to be an academic format, and one that's going to be a more popular format or professional format. So, they have to write a paper, but they also have to do a podcast, or they have to write an abstract, or they also have to do a social media post. So from the beginning, students know within this assignment that they're going to have different audiences, that they're going to have different purposes, and so that they have to keep that in mind, think about how that impacts the way that they go about searching for information and which sources they use within each context. And then I think this is the last sample assignment that I have there. This is thinking in terms of the search statements that students use. So getting students to recognize how search results can differ depending on what specific terms that you use. So your results for guns and crime are going to probably be pretty different than your results for guns and protection, or protest and violence versus protest and freedom. And you can pick search terms that are relevant to your discipline, or have students pick terms that are relevant to their particular research paper or project assignment. And so thinking about, it's not just about which search tool we use, it's also about the words that we use. that is going to impact our results as well. You know, that is part of the context of our search. Right. So we'll pause here again. We'll go back to this and see if folks have other ideas of ways that you encourage to consider students to consider context when searching. And I'll go back to the chat and see if there's anything that I missed in there. Yep, great. So if anything does pop into mind, please feel free again to go ahead and share it. And we'll just go through some final last things here. So if there are any questions that anyone has at this point, any comments, any recommendations, for once we actually have some time for questions. I'm usually, as anyone who's been to one of my workshops before knows, I'm usually like rushing at the very end. So we actually have some time for questions today. A few resources that I did want to highlight. I mentioned earlier this tool that Librarians had developed at University of Albany SUNY. It's a module on the contextual nature of research, and there's a 4-part video. So they have an introduction video that kind of raises this issue. They talk about what research is. They examine those different research contexts that we talk about and talk about why that is important. And then students can actually, there's like an assignment that students can do. So you could modify this. This is open to anyone. It's not necessary. It's not limited to University of Albany students. So if this is something that you find relevant, the videos are all quite short and there's captions for all of those. So this could be a great tool to get students thinking about the contextual nature of research. I think the link is in the ones that I put in the chat. So yeah, that's that last link for those ones that I put in the chat on the contextual nature of research. If anyone is interested in taking a look at that site. At Ohio State, we have the instructor resources at university libraries. If you haven't had a chance to look at this tool, we have information and resources in all of these different categories. So search tools, strategies, research questions, types of information sources. So I'm gonna go out here. Okay, I had this up. Yeah, so hopefully folks are seeing the page here that says teaching research and information literacy. So you can see here, here's the different categories of information that we have. We go to search tools and search strategies. You see what we have. We have relevant readings, relevant videos that we've identified, as well as some sample assignments. So all of those are free to use, incorporate into your courses. And let's see, go back here. And one last resource I wanted to mention, the Teaching and Learning Resource Center has information literacy concepts and teaching strategies. So this is also a resource that's available. I actually don't think I have this linked up, but what am I? So if you take a look at this side here, you'll see that all of the core concepts that we discussed, so searching as strategic exploration, information creation is a process, authority is constructed, all of those have definitions and teaching strategies and activities that are available there, as well as other types of resources. So all of those tools, I recommend that you take a look at any of those and use anything that you find relevant there on those resources. And back here. And so as we are coming to the end, then again, we have some time for questions. If you have a key takeaway that you would like to share, I would love to hear what you got out of this workshop that you think might be really relevant to you going forward. Any next steps that you have planned for how you might go about using some of these resources, please feel free to go ahead and add any of that into the chat. As I mentioned, do have some workshops coming up. Our next one is on reflective and critical evaluation strategies next Thursday, same time. Then we have responsible and ethical information practices, information literacy in the disciplinary context, and intersections of information literacy and citizenship. So all of those are coming up. I'll send registration links to everyone for those and the follow-up email. So we'll pause here again. questions, key takeaways, and next steps. And again, you can put those in the chat, or if you would rather unmute and speak up, you can also do that as well at this point. Sarah shared, love the idea of scaffolding students' thoughts around context, purpose of their work, and appropriate next steps in their search, and making that thinking visible for feedback and support. Yeah, Sarah, I think the way you phrased that was really great. Making that thinking visible for feedback and support. I love that phrase, right? So it's helpful for the students to make their own thinking on the search process visible. It's helpful for you as instructor that you see what they are thinking about, and so that you can give that feedback, that you can give course corrections if needed. Great way to think about that. Let me go back here. And Michael, you had the question earlier. Let's see if I can get back to that. So interesting to me that reflective discovery and participating ethically are included in the definition. Why do you think? Can you expand a little bit more about what you're looking at? Interested in there, Michael? You can feel free to unmute if you want, or you can type it if you'd rather do that. Either way is fine.
Hi, it's Michael. First of all, fantastic session. I really appreciate this. The reason I asked the question, the definition is comprised of 4 components. And I found it very interesting that the ethical aspect was included, as if by the implication there are unethical possibilities. And then the reflectiveness, that someone really needs to think first, the thinking skill is emphasized. And I was just wondering, from your expertise, why do you think that what the definition could have been comprised of any components that the group or panel wanted to? Why do you think they included those 2 among the 4, please?
So I think that's a really great question. Thank you for sharing that. So as I mentioned, if you look back at sort of earlier definitions of information literacy, the most common definition basically was that information literacy was the ability to find, evaluate, and use information. And it was basically sort of the same for all sort of information needs or searches. It was just sort of this very mechanical search process of, here's my information need, here's how I'm going to go out, I'm going to search this tool, I'm going to find this information. And that was sort of how information literacy was presented. So there were a lot of concerns that librarians and other folks started to raise about that definition, that it was too limited. It did not take into account context. It didn't take into account all of the different ways that students would be searching for information. And it didn't take into account anything, any of the affective components of information searching. So that new definition was an attempt to bring in some of those things that were missing from that earlier definition. So emphasizing this idea that, it's not just search, that there's also metacognitive aspects in terms of searching for information. So I think that was really where that reflective component came in. So it's not just about being able to search, it's about being able to think about how you search and why you search and what you're searching for. And I think similar in terms of the ethical component, although there was an ethical component in their previous understandings of information literacy, I don't think it was ever highlighted enough. Thinking about something like complying with copyright law. On the one hand, we might say it's ethical to always comply with copyright law, but is it always really? There's lots of folks, complaints that have been raised about copyright law. So maybe a student might feel it's actually more ethical to not. Not that I'm proposing that, but that students are thinking more critically about what ethical information behavior is. And so that they're being reflective consumers and creators of information, not just users of information. So yeah, thank you. Hopefully that does answer that question. So, thank you. Thank you for that question, Michael. See, Teresa shared, I feel like our students have used variations in search skills and considered a pre-course survey to better understand where they need to develop. I think that is a great idea. I highly recommend the use of pre-post surveys. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that. Folks know I talk a lot about doing true, false, just very quick kind of statements like that, but expanding as well into various kinds of pre and post tests so that you get an idea of what their pre-existing knowledge is on searching. I think that is a great idea. Sorry, the response is coming in. So a question on tech question, why couldn't I see the second Jamboard that you displayed? I was only able to see the first one and not the second one. It might be, Marjorie, that there's a little thing that you have to click at the top of the Jamboard to switch between one or the other. And maybe I might not have shown, given enough time for folks to see how to switch between those. So I apologize for that one. Let's see. The response is coming in. So you have a question: if instructors are able to provide this information as supplemental activities and videos on the learning management system, in your experience or research, have you found this effective? Do students engage with them or take advantage of them? That's a really great question. I think it does depend on if they have any incentive to do so. If they're just available as supplemental resources, likely most students are not really going to engage with them. But if you could make them even low stakes activities, where it's not, they're not going to be huge amounts of points, but there is some incentive for students to participate. I do think that that might be a little bit more effective. So I know that we have just 2 minutes left. If there are any additional questions, comments, or thoughts, please feel free to share those.